They called them steel coffins. Once the hatch was sealed, every man inside knew his odds, not of victory, of survival. Only 30% of submarine torpedo crews ever came back alive in World War II. The rest vanished beneath the waves, trapped in silence, crushed by depth charges, or suffocated in darkness where no one could hear them scream. Yet still, men volunteered for this service, convinced they could beat the odds. In this video, we're going inside their world. The claustrophobic tension of life underwater, the brutal statistics behind the losses, and the hidden design flaws that doomed entire crews before they even fired a single torpedo. By the end, you'll understand why serving on a submarine wasn't just a mission, it was a death sentence. At the outbreak of World War II, submarine service was wrapped in a strange mystique. Navies across the globe promoted it as an elite branch. Dangerous, yes, but also noble and heroic. In Germany, the propaganda machine celebrated U-boat crews as wolves of the Atlantic, daring hunters who could cut off Britain's lifeline to the New World. Posters and newsreels showed smiling sailors returning from patrol, greeted by flowers and adoring crowds. In the United States, the submarine force was hailed as the Silent Service, a brotherhood of men fighting unseen beneath the seas, striking blows where the enemy least expected. And in Japan, submarine crews were praised as guardians of the empire's far-flung waters, symbols of dedication and honor. On the surface, it all looked like glory. Young men signed up in droves, believing they were volunteering for the most exciting adventure the war could offer. What they couldn't see was that beneath the propaganda was a death sentence. The statistics were merciless. By the end of the war, German U-boat crews suffered a 75% death rate, a figure unmatched by almost any other branch of service. In Japan, design flaws, poor training, and increasingly effective Allied countermeasures meant that submariners faced equally grim odds, with entire vessels simply vanishing without trace. Even in the United States, where submarines achieved remarkable success against Japanese shipping, casualty rates hovered around 22%, far higher than most other naval branches. For every smiling crew on a propaganda poster, there were hundreds who never returned, their families left with silence instead of closure. The allure of the submarine service was built on illusions of adventure and honor, but for most of the men who stepped into those steel coffins, the truth was far darker. They weren't just hunters of the deep, they were already marked as prey. At the outbreak of World War II, submarine service was wrapped in a strange mystique. Navies across the globe promoted it as an elite branch. Dangerous, yes, but also noble and heroic. In Germany, the propaganda machine celebrated U-boat crews as wolves of the Atlantic, daring hunters who could cut off Britain's lifeline to the New World. Posters and newsreels showed smiling sailors returning from patrols, greeted by flowers and adoring crowds. In the United States, the submarine force was hailed as the Silent Service, a brotherhood of men fighting unseen beneath the seas, striking blows where the enemy least expected. And in Japan, submarine crews were praised as guardians of the empire's far-flung waters, symbols of dedication and honor. On the surface, it all looked like glory. Young men signed up in droves, believing they were volunteering for the most exciting adventure the war could offer. What they couldn't see was that beneath the propaganda was a death sentence. The statistics were merciless. By the end of the war, German U-boat crews suffered a 75% death rate, a figure unmatched by almost any other branch of service. In Japan, design flaws, poor training, and increasingly effective Allied countermeasures meant that submariners faced equally grim odds, with entire vessels simply vanishing without trace. Even in the United States, where submarines achieved remarkable success against Japanese shipping, casualty rates hovered around 22%, Zrenia far higher than most other naval branches. For every smiling crew on a propaganda poster, there were hundreds who never returned, their families left with silence instead of closure. The allure of the submarine service was built on illusions of adventure and honor, but for most of the men who stepped into those steel coffins, the truth was far darker. They weren't just hunters of the deep, they were already marked as prey. Daily life aboard a submarine was a waking nightmare. Once the hatch was sealed, the outside world disappeared, and the crew descended into a reality that was part prison, part tomb. The space was suffocating. Men slept in bunks, stacked so tightly that they could feel each other breathing, often forced to share beds in shifts, a practice grimly known as hot racking. Privacy didn't exist. Fresh food ran out quickly, and what remained turned foul. In some U-boats, bread became coated with mold, and potatoes sprouted in the damp heat. Canned goods were staples, but they tasted of tin, and by the end of a patrol, the crew ate whatever hadn't spoiled. Hygiene was almost non-existent. With no showers and little fresh water, men stayed unwashed for weeks at a time. The smell of diesel fuel clung to everything, mixing with sweat, body odor, and the ever-present stench of mildew. Rats sometimes appeared, feeding on scraps and gnawing at clothing. The air itself became a weapon. As oxygen levels dropped and carbon dioxide rose, men felt dizzy, nauseated, and weak. On long patrols, U-boat sailors described a constant sense of suffocation, with the atmosphere so thick it felt like breathing through a wet cloth. In American submarines, conditions were marginally better, but the claustrophobic dread was universal. Every noise carried weight. The groan of the hull, the hiss of a valve, the distant ping of sonar, all of it was a reminder that a single failure could mean instant death. Fires could erupt from electrical malfunctions, while the battery room posed another nightmare. If seawater touched the lead-acid batteries, it released chlorine gas, filling compartments with a choking green cloud. For the men inside, every second was a reminder that they lived in a fragile coffin, suspended between survival and obliteration. And yet, they endured, knowing that even before combat began, the submarine itself was trying to kill them. Among the most vital and most vulnerable positions aboard a submarine were the torpedo crews. These were the men responsible for loading, maintaining, and firing the submarine's primary weapon. Their world was confined to cramped compartments filled with warheads, machinery, and danger. Each torpedo was a steel cylinder packed with hundreds of pounds of explosives, and the slightest mistake could spell disaster. In German U-boats, torpedo crews worked under constant strain, knowing their weapons were often unreliable. Malfunctions plagued the early war years, with dud torpedoes, faulty detonators, or weapons that curved off course. The men who handled them were sometimes blamed for these failures, adding guilt to an already impossible burden. In the U.S. Navy, the situation was similarly dire at the start. American Mark 14 torpedoes suffered from chronic defects that led to wasted attacks and catastrophic missed opportunities. Imagine the frustration of risking everything to sneak into position, only to have your torpedo bounce harmlessly off an enemy hull. For the torpedo crews, these failures weren't just technical, they were personal. They had to sit in the suffocating darkness, sweating, reloading, and preparing to fire again, knowing that every second spent exposed to the enemy increased the chance of death by depth charge. Japanese torpedo crews faced another grim reality. Their submarines often carried experimental or poorly tested weapons, and safety standards were minimal. Explosions during handling were not uncommon. In every navy, torpedo crews also had the shortest survival window in combat. If the forward compartment was breached by an enemy weapon, the men inside had no chance. Survivors later described hearing desperate pounding on the bulkheads as torpedo men drowned, trapped with no escape. To be part of the torpedo crew was to live every second in proximity to death, handling explosives inside a steel coffin designed to kill others, but just as often killing its own men. If there was one sound that submarine crews feared more than any other, it was the metallic ping of sonar. That single note meant the enemy had found them, and the clock was ticking. Soon after came the thunder of depth charges, steel barrels filled with explosives, set to detonate at pre-programmed depths. To the men inside a submarine, the experience was nothing short of hell. The first explosion would slam the hull like a giant hammer blow, shaking the entire vessel and knocking men from their bunks. Lights flickered, gauges shattered, pipes burst. Then came another blast, and and another. It was relentless, like being trapped in a coffin while giants pounded on it from above. Survivors often recalled how the concussions made their ears bleed, teeth rattle, and skulls throb. One U-boat veteran described the sensation as your bones vibrating apart. In some cases, the hull would flex so violently that men swore it would crack. Silence between explosions was almost worse. Every second stretched into eternity as the crew waited for the next charge to detonate. If a seal failed, seawater would spray in under immense pressure, flooding compartments in seconds. Those near the point of impact were often killed instantly by the shockwave, their bodies flung like rag dolls. And unlike surface ships, there was nowhere to run. Submarine doctrine taught crews to dive deeper, cut engines, and sit in silence, hoping the enemy would lose track. That silence was agony. The only sounds were labored breathing and the groaning hull. For torpedo crews in the forward compartment, this was pure terror. They sat surrounded by live warheads, knowing a single shock could detonate them. For German crews, depth charge barrages could last for hours, sometimes days, as Allied destroyers worked in shifts to pound the ocean. In the Pacific, Japanese submariners endured the same torment, hunted by American destroyers using radar and sonar in tandem. Few men who experienced a full-scale depth charge attack ever forgot it, and many did not survive it. To be hunted this way was not just combat, it was psychological torture stretched across hours of unbearable suspense. For submarine crews, death did not always come in fire and noise. More often, it came in silence. Across every theater of the war, entire boats simply disappeared. Families received telegrams weeks or months later. Missing in action. No wreckage, no bodies, no survivors, just absence. In the Atlantic, German U-boat losses were staggering. Out of roughly 40,000 men who served, 30,000 were killed. Many of their boats were last heard reporting a position before vanishing forever, consumed by the ocean. In the Pacific, American and Japanese submarines met the same fate. The United States lost 52 submarines during the war, carrying nearly 3,600 men to the bottom. Japan's losses were even worse. More than 60% of its submarines were destroyed, leaving tens of thousands of sailors entombed beneath the waves. The terrifying truth was that submariners lived with this knowledge every day. Their vessel was not just a ship, it was their grave waiting to close. Once struck, whether by depth charge, aircraft bomb, or even a mechanical failure, escape was virtually impossible. Unlike surface ships, submarines lacked lifeboats. There was no chance to abandon ship. Crews could attempt emergency surfacing, but if the hull was breached or the ballast systems failed, they sank. Trapped below crush depth, the steel warped inward until rivets popped like gunshots, and the pressure crushed men instantly. Survivors from partial sinkings recalled the horror of hearing their comrades locked in compartments, pounding and screaming as water rushed in until the sound faded. Even more haunting was the knowledge that many submarines still lie intact on the ocean floor today, effectively sealed tomb. For families, this disappearance was devastating. There was no body to bury, no grave to visit, only a name etched into a memorial wall. To be a submariner was to walk into service knowing that if death came, it would erase you completely, leaving no trace but silence. Submarine warfare was not just fought with torpedoes and depth charges, it was fought inside the minds of the men who served. From the moment the hatch closed, they entered an environment designed to break the human spirit. Claustrophobia was the first enemy. Imagine weeks or months in a tube barely large enough to stand upright, where every wall was sweating with condensation and every bunk was within arm's reach of another man. The absence of sunlight created a world without day or night, only the ticking of the clock and the dim glow of red or yellow bulbs. For many, time blurred together until they lost track of how long they had been submerged. Anxiety gnawed constantly. Every creak of the hull could be the first sign of failure. Every sonar ping overhead could signal incoming death. Submarine commanders enforced silence during hunts, forbidding talking, coughing, even shifting in one's bunk. Some sailors later said the silence itself was worse than the explosions. Sleep deprivation was another weapon. With shifts running in rotations and constant readiness required, men rarely got more than a few hours of rest. When they did, they dreamed of suffocating, drowning, or being crushed. Many woke up gasping, unsure if it was real. For some, paranoia set in. In both German and American fleets, records note cases of breakdowns where sailors became convinced the boat was already doomed, or that others were plotting sabotage. Japanese crews, often pushed into near-suicidal missions, sometimes faced despair so profound that morale disintegrated. Yet, through all of this, they endured. Brotherhood became the only lifeline. Sailors clung to rituals, singing songs, telling jokes, carving notches into the walls to distract from the fire. Still, the psychological toll was undeniable. Many survivors later admitted that even after leaving the service, they couldn't sleep without nightmares of the deep. Submarine duty did not just take lives, it left lasting scars on those who survived. To serve beneath the waves was to live in a war not just of steel and fire, but of the human mind itself. The raw statistics of submarine warfare strip away any illusion of glory. For German U-boat crews, the survival rate was barely 25%. Out of 40,000 men, 30,000 died. For Japanese crews, the odds were even worse, as nearly 3 out of 4 submariners never came back. American crews fared better, but even so, thousands perished. 3,600 men entombed in 52 submarines that were lost forever. These numbers meant that for every crew that celebrated a safe return, 2 or 3 others had been erased beneath the sea. What made the fate of submariners uniquely cruel was its finality. Surface sailors might be rescued by lifeboats. Airmen who bailed out had a chance of capture, but submariners almost never had a way out. Once a submarine slipped beneath the waves and failed to resurface, its crew was already dead. The ocean became both battlefield and burial ground, swallowing thousands of men whose names remain carved only on memorials. It was war's most merciless equation. The longer you served, the more certain your death became. When the war ended, the nightmare did not. Survivors carried the scars for life. Many could never forget the smell of diesel fumes, the groaning hull, or the endless silence between depth-charge blasts. Veterans spoke of waking at night, convinced they were still trapped underwater. Some could never go near the ocean again, and yet their legacy is one of both tragedy and awe. Submarine crews were often teenagers when they volunteered, choosing one of the most lethal assignments in history. Their sacrifice crippled enemy supply lines, sank merchant fleets, and shaped the course of the war, but at a staggering human cost. Today, thousands of submarines still lie at the bottom of the oceans, silent steel coffins holding entire crews. They serve as haunting reminders of the price these men paid. The truth is simple. Only 30% of torpedo crews ever survived, and those who did were left with memories darker than the waters they once called home. Their story is not just about war. It's about endurance, sacrifice, and the cost of waging battle in the loneliest place on Earth.